Caleb Thorne learned that charity could be the cruelest weapon of all. It was not a gift he received from the town of prosperity, but a sentence. Standing before the town council in the dusty church hall, he felt the weight of every gaze, a mixture of pity and contempt that was heavier than any condemnation. He was the man whose ambition had outrun his luck, the rancher whose failed cattle drive had taken a good portion of the town's invested savings with it. They couldn't run him out of the county, but they could exile him in place. Their solution was presented as an act of Christian mercy. He was to be given the old Miller homestead, a patch of sun-scorched earth and a collapsing cabin 3 miles out, a place long abandoned to the wind and weeds. And to ensure the disgraced bachelor wasn't alone in his penance, they were giving him a wife. Her name was Mai, and she was the town's other outcast. The widow of a Chinese railway worker, she lived in a small shack at the edge of town, silent and isolated. Rumor, sharp and unkind, said she was barren, a woman whose first husband had died without an heir, leaving her doubly cursed in the eyes of the community. The preacher presented it as a perfect pairing, a broken man and a barren woman, sent to a barren piece of land. A cruel, symmetrical poetry. As Mai was brought forward, she did not look at Caleb. Her eyes were fixed on the floorboards, her small frame wrapped in a quiet dignity that seemed to defy the humiliation of the moment. Caleb met her gaze for a single, fleeting second and saw in her dark eyes the same thing he felt in his own soul, the profound and suffocating loneliness of being utterly unwanted. The wagon ride to the Miller homestead was a journey of suffocating silence. The rattle of the wheels and the tired sigh of the mule were the only sounds that dared to intrude upon the vast, empty space between them. Caleb kept his eyes on the horizon, his jaw tight, while Mai sat perfectly still, a small bundle of her meager possessions clutched in her lap. The homestead was worse than he remembered. The cabin sagged like a tired old man, its porch roof slanted in defeat. The well was choked with debris, and the field was a graveyard of withered stalks and stubborn rocks. It was a place where hope had come to die. For the first week, they moved around each other like ghosts haunting the same forgotten space. They did not speak. Their communication was a language of absence and necessity. He cleared the well while she swept years of dust and decay from the cabin's single room. He patched the leaking roof, and in the evening, he would find a bowl of thin but hot broth made from foraged roots waiting on the rough-hewn table. She never watched him eat. He would leave chopped firewood by the door in the morning, and she would use it without a word of acknowledgement. They slept in separate corners of the room, the dying embers of the fire a small, flickering truce in the cold darkness. He was the resilient outcast, and she was the wounded hermit, 2 solitary planets forced into a shared, silent orbit. There was no pretense of a marriage, only the grim reality of a shared exile. He saw the way she would sometimes stare out at the barren field, her expression unreadable, and he wondered about the life she had lost, about the man who had brought her to this unforgiving country only to leave her alone in it. The change began not with a word, but with the turning of the earth. One morning, Caleb saw Mai in the small, rock-strewn patch of land beside the cabin. She was using a sharpened stick to break up the hard, unforgiving soil, her movements patient and methodical. He watched her for a long time from the barn he was attempting to repair. He had a spare spade with a cracked handle. That afternoon, he took the time to fix it, wrapping the handle tightly with strips of leather. He didn't hand it to her. He simply left it leaning against the cabin wall near where she worked. The next morning, the stick was gone, and the spade was in its place, making steady, rhythmic work of the stubborn ground. A few days later, as the sun beat down on him while he resank a fence post, he found a tin cup of cool well water sitting on the post beside him. He drank it, the water a balm to his parched throat, and when he looked toward the cabin, he saw her silhouette in the doorway for just a moment before she disappeared back inside. These were the first words of their new language, a mended handle, a cup of water. It was a language of mutual respect, an acknowledgement of shared struggle. The garden became her domain, a small square of hope in the vastness of their desolation. And as Caleb worked to tame the wild edges of the property, fortifying their small shelter against the elements, he found himself protecting her quiet, determined efforts as much as he was protecting himself. He started clearing the larger rocks from her plot, rolling them to the edge to form a crude wall, and he never once questioned the purpose of her relentless labor on land that had given up long ago. The sky had been a bruised purple for hours before the storm finally broke. It came not with gentle rain, but with a sudden, violent fury, the wind howling like a hungry wolf around the corners of the small cabin. Rain hammered against the newly patched roof, and the world outside was reduced to a churning chaos of water and noise. A powerful gust tore at the old barn, and the sound of splintering wood sent Caleb running outside into the deluge. A large section of the barn wall had given way, exposing their single mule and a handful of chickens to the raging storm. He fought against the wind, trying to herd the terrified animals toward the relative safety of the cabin, his clothes soaked through in an instant. Suddenly, Mai was there beside him, her small frame braced against the wind, her black hair plastered to her face. She held a length of rope in one hand and a lantern in the other, its light a fragile beacon in the maelstrom. Without a word, she moved to calm the mule while Caleb scrambled to secure a loose door that was banging violently against its frame. Together, they worked in the heart of the tempest, a frantic, unspoken partnership. They managed to get the animals into the lean-to behind the cabin and barricade the opening just as the storm reached its zenith. They stumbled back inside, drenched and shivering, the door groaning shut behind them. For a long time, they just stood there, dripping on the floor, the sound of their own ragged breaths mingling with the roar of the storm. That night, they sat on opposite sides of the hearth, sharing the warmth of the fire. The silence between them was different now. It was no longer an empty void, but a shared space, filled with the quiet comfort of having weathered the storm together. In the calm, clean-washed world after the storm, something had permanently shifted. The walls between them, once so impenetrable, had been worn down by shared hardship. One evening, as Mai was carefully tending to the first, tentative green shoots that had finally pushed their way through the soil in her garden, Caleb approached. He stood for a moment, simply watching the gentle way she worked, before speaking. "It's a good start," he said, his voice quiet. She did not look up, but she did not flinch away from his presence either. "My husband," she began, her voice soft, almost rusty from disuse, "he said I had a gift for making things grow." It was the first time she had ever mentioned him. Caleb leaned against the fence post, giving her the space to continue if she chose. "He was a good man. Strong. He promised me a garden one day. A big one, filled with flowers from my home." She paused, her fingers gently tracing the edge of a new leaf. "He died before the first winter. The fever took him. After that, there was no one. And no baby came. The women in town, they looked at me with pity. They said I was empty." The confession hung in the air, simple and devastating. Caleb felt a pang of understanding so sharp it was almost painful. He knew what it was to be defined by your failures, to be stripped of your name and given a label, failed rancher, barren widow. "I lost a herd of cattle," he found himself saying, the words coming out before he had a chance to stop them. "My own foolish pride. A bad winter, and I thought I knew better than the old-timers. I lost everything. Not just my money, but my father's name." They stood there for a long time as the sun set, two outcasts sharing the ghosts of their past, the barren land around them listening to their quiet confessions. Life settled into a new rhythm, a quiet partnership built on a foundation of shared work and unspoken understanding. The homestead, once a symbol of their exile, was slowly becoming a home. The garden was thriving under Mai's patient care, a vibrant patch of green against the brown earth. Caleb had repaired the barn and mended the last of the fences. They still spoke little, but now there was an easy comfort in their shared silence. One afternoon, while checking a line of snares he had set in the low hills to the east, Caleb saw it. A plume of black smoke, thick and oily, rising into the clear blue sky. It was too much for a campfire. A sense of unease prickled his skin, and he urged his horse into a trot. As he crested the final rise, the scene below made him pull up short. An overturned wagon lay splintered at the bottom of a ravine, its contents scattered like a child's discarded toys. One of the wheels was still spinning slowly, a final, futile gesture of movement. The smoke was coming from a small fire that had started in the dry grass nearby. He scrambled down the rocky incline, his heart pounding. The scene was one of tragic finality. But then he heard it. A sound so small and out of place it was almost unreal, a thin, wavering cry. He followed the sound to a small bundle of blankets, miraculously thrown clear of the wreckage. He knelt and gently pulled back the cloth. Inside, a baby stared up at him, its face red and tear-streaked, its tiny fists balled in distress. It couldn't be more than a few months old. Caleb looked around, his gaze sweeping the silent, grim scene. There were no other survivors. He was alone with the wail of an orphan child and the vast, indifferent wilderness. Carefully, he lifted the infant, holding it awkwardly against his chest. The child's cries softened into small whimpers. In that moment, holding this small, helpless life, Caleb felt a profound shift within him, a surge of fierce, protective instinct he never knew he possessed. When Caleb walked into the cabin carrying the baby, Mai was grinding corn. She looked up, her eyes widening first at his disheveled state, then at the bundle in his arms. He didn't have to say a word. The story was written on his face. She rose slowly, wiping her hands on her apron, and came toward him. She peered down at the infant, whose whimpers had started up again. Her expression, usually so guarded, softened into something he had never seen before, a look of profound, aching tenderness. Without hesitation, she reached out and took the child from his arms. The baby, as if sensing a new and gentler presence, quieted almost immediately, its small head nestling into the crook of her neck. That evening, their small cabin was transformed. The quiet solitude was replaced by the small sounds of a new life. Mai, with an instinct that seemed to rise from a place deep within her, cared for the child with a gentle efficiency that amazed him. She fashioned diapers from old flour sacks and fed the baby a thin gruel of cornmeal and water from the tip of her finger. Caleb spent the evening by the fire, carving a crude but functional cradle from a discarded wooden crate. He watched her humming a soft, wordless lullaby to the baby, her face illuminated by the firelight, and he saw not the barren widow the town had cast out, but a mother. The child, a boy, had brought something new into their home, something beyond mere survival. He was a catalyst, a tiny, helpless innocent who was forcing them to become something more than two lonely people sharing a roof. They were becoming a family. The cruel joke of their union had been answered by the miracle of a foundling. News of the discovered child traveled faster than a prairie fire. It wasn't long before a buggy crested the hill, carrying a man in a stiff suit and a bowler hat. His name was Arthur Finch, a banker from the next county over, and he carried a ledger and an air of officious authority. He explained, in a tone devoid of sympathy, that the family in the wagon, the Abernathys, had been heavily in debt to his bank. The wagon and its contents were now bank property, to be seized to cover the losses. As for the child, he was to be taken to the state orphanage. Finch spoke of the boy not as a person, but as a complication, a loose end to be tied up. It is the law, he stated, peering around the simple cabin with a disdainful sniff. The child needs proper care, not to be raised in a place like this by people like you. The insult was clear and sharp. Caleb felt a cold anger rise within him, but it was Mai who responded first. She had been standing silently by the cradle, but now she stepped forward, placing herself between Finch and the sleeping baby. She didn't speak, but her posture, the fierce, protective light in her eyes, was a declaration. She would not let this man take her son. For in her heart, that is what he had already become. Caleb moved to stand beside her, a silent, unbreachable wall. "The boy stays here," Caleb said, his voice low and steady, laced with a resolve that surprised even himself. Finch scoffed. "You have no legal claim. You are nothing to him, and we're the ones who found him," Caleb countered. "We're the ones who've cared for him. That makes us something." The banker's face hardened. "This is not over. I will be back with the sheriff." Finch was true to his word. 2 days later, he returned, and with him was not just the sheriff, but a small procession of riders from Prosperity. The preacher was there, as were several of the town councilmen who had sentenced Caleb to this exile. They had come to witness the final act of his failure, to see the law confirm what they already believed, that a man like him, and a woman like her, were unfit. They gathered in the yard, their faces a mixture of morbid curiosity and grim satisfaction. Finch, emboldened by his audience, strode onto the porch. "Sheriff," he began, "I am here to take possession of the orphan child, as is my legal right." The sheriff, a weary man named Tate, looked from Finch to the couple standing in the doorway. Caleb stood tall, his face set like stone. Beside him, Mai held the baby wrapped tightly in a blue blanket, her gaze fixed on Finch with an unblinking intensity that was more powerful than any weapon. "He has a name," Mai said, her voice clear and strong, ringing out across the silent yard. "His name is An. It means peace." It was a challenge, a refusal to let them reduce her son to an object. Caleb stepped forward. "This is our home," he said, his voice carrying the weight of all the work, all the hardship, and all the quiet moments that had transformed this place. "And this is our son. You are not taking him for the first time." The people of Prosperity were not looking at two outcasts. They saw a man and a woman, standing together as one, a portrait of fierce, unwavering devotion. They saw the thriving garden, the repaired barn, the solid fence line. They saw that this barren land was no longer barren. They saw that these two broken people were no longer broken. They had built a life here, and at the center of it was a child they would clearly die for. The preacher, a man whose voice had condemned Caleb months ago, was the first to break the silence. He cleared his throat, his gaze fixed on the small family unit on the porch. He saw not a punishment, but a testament. "Mr. Finch," the preacher said, his tone measured and thoughtful, "while the letter of the law may be on your side, it seems to me that the spirit of it is standing right here." He gestured toward Caleb and Mai. "This child has a home." "A good 1 inch." One by one, the other men from town murmured their agreement. They had come expecting to see a ruin, but they had found a sanctuary instead. The collective will of the community, once turned so cruelly against Caleb and Mai, now turned against the greedy outsider. The sheriff, seeing the shift, sighed and tipped his hat. "Finch, it seems the town has spoken. There's nothing for you here." Defeated and humiliated, Finch could only sputter in protest before turning and storming back to his buggy. The townspeople lingered for a moment, a few of them offering quiet, respectful nods before they mounted their horses and rode away, leaving behind a new kind of silence, one of acceptance. Caleb looked at Mai, who was gazing down at the sleeping child in her arms. He reached out and, for the first time, gently touched her cheek. She leaned into his touch for just a moment, a silent acknowledgement of all they had overcome. They had been sent to this desolate place as a cruel joke, a punishment meant to break them. But here, on this land the world had forgotten, they had found more than just survival. They had found redemption. They had found each other. And they had found that a family is not something you are born into, but something you build, with your own 2 hands, in the wilderness of a lonely heart.